also by members of the public, and as well grateful for the members of the media that are here, and especially grateful for our partner, the Women's Leadership Institute, and Pat Jones, the president and CEO of that organization, in this announcement today. I want to start off my remarks by recognizing what many, if not all of us, know, and that is that we live in a tremendous state at a tremendous time. How our economy is growing is really phenomenal. There are so many areas that Utah is number one in, including number one for the fastest growing population and number one for the fastest growing economy as measured by job growth. Despite all the great number ones that we have and the many accolades that we have, there is an area where Utah is not doing well. And in order to keep our economic success growing, I think it's important that we not only pat ourselves on the back and talk about the good things that are happening in Utah, but where there are areas of weakness and areas for improvement, we need to be wise enough to be able to recognize those areas and, more importantly, wise enough to correct them. And one area where we have a great need for correction is in the gender pay gap. This is an area where Utah is not number one. In fact, Utah is the worst in the nation by a number of reports for the pay disparity between men and women. Yet at the same time, we recognize the important role that women and women-owned businesses play in Utah's economic success. In 2017, the State of Women-Owned Business Report, that's a national report, it ranked Utah 7th in the nation in areas over the last decade where women-owned businesses have increased their economic clout. In Salt Lake City specifically, in the last year alone, we saw women-owned businesses climbing nearly 40%. Yet, even in cases where they are the owner, women still fall far behind in pay equity in businesses of all sizes. Now, I want to make this point clear, that I do not believe that there is any business owner or business leader in our state that wakes up in the morning and asks themselves, what can I do today to make sure that the women in my organization are paid less than the men? Yet, we know that that still happens, either because of unconscious workplace biases or unintentional business processes. Let me give you just a quick example. This was a personal example that I experienced this past week as I was reviewing and preparing for this press conference. One of the areas that our teams found happens as an unconscious bias in the workplace is that studies show that men are more likely to negotiate their entry-level pay than women are. And I have to tell you, I was surprised when I read that in the report. I thought, I didn't know that. I didn't know that women were less likely to ask and negotiate for a higher pay on a job offer. When I was reviewing the report, I happened to be sitting next to my wife, and I commented to her. I said, Laura, can you believe that this study has shown that women are less likely to negotiate their pay than men are? And her response to me was, wait, you can negotiate your pay offer? That was a true story that illustrated the point to me. For all of these reasons, the Salt Lake Chamber has partnered with the Women's Leadership Institute to work together with our members and the business community at large to create a guidebook of best practices to identify problems and solutions that are necessary to close the gender wage gap. It's this document right here, and we're pleased to be able to roll it out today. In just a moment, Pat Jones will be telling us more about the specifics contained in this best practices guidebook. Our teams worked together for months to gather research-based practices and policies, to collect feedback from real Utah business leaders, to create the best possible handbook and guide for companies to have in their toolkit. In fact, I want to thank the entire focus group that worked with us to put this together. A special thanks to the members of the focus group who are here with us today. We have Laura Bogish from Boeing, Braden Jensen from Century West, and Melanie Vardabedian from Ballard Spar. We appreciate your help in putting this together. Finding ways to close the gender wage gap will have benefits far beyond workplace equality. You all know that Utah's #1 challenge to our economy right now is finding skilled workers. In fact, when I talk to business leaders all around the state, they tell me that is their #1 challenge. And closing the gender pay gap is an important way to overcome this challenge. I recognize that too often in this discussion, this devolves into a debate about competing data. Too many times when we talk about the gender pay gap, people fall into a pitfall of saying, what was the study, what was the methodology, and then start questioning whether or not it's valid. Now, some studies show that it may be a 50 cent to $1 pay gap. Some studies show that it may be an 80 cent to $1 pay gap. But my message today is, let's not fall into a trap of dueling data and thereby miss the point. Because the point is that whether it's 50 cents to $1 or 80 cents to $1, or whether Utah is the worst in the country or the 10th worst in the country, in my mind, that doesn't really matter. What matters is that we recognize there is room for improvement. And that's why today we're calling on all Utah businesses to utilize this guidebook to figure out what best practices they can employ that work most for them in the short run and the long run. Now, as I said, Utah is not doing well in this area. That's the bad news. But the good news is this: we have the power to fix it. As a business community, we can do this. And we can lead out on this issue, showing not just Utahns, but also the nation, that we are a state that will pay equally for equal work, and that we will be leaders in creating solutions to our economic challenges. Now, as I mentioned, we're grateful at the Salt Lake Chamber to have partnered with the Women's Leadership Institute on this important initiative. And now I'd like to turn the microphone over to the Women's Leadership Institute President and CEO, Pat Jones.
Thank you, Derek. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. There are a number of factors that contribute to Utah's poor rating in the gender pay gap. The wage gap in Utah is real, however, and it hurts us. The good news is that we can solve it, as Derek has just mentioned. I wanted to congratulate the Chamber and thank them, the staff, of course, President and CEO of the Chamber, for taking this issue on. This is not an easy issue for many companies. It's really one of the few in the Elevate Her Challenge that some people just really wonder if they can actually tackle it. And we can. We have a significant opportunity before us to be leaders in closing this gap. Members of Utah's business community are willing and able to not only take the necessary steps to ensure the work that Utah women do and perform is valued fairly, but also prove that we can be leaders in creating solutions that result in the equitable pay environment. This best practices guidebook identifies specific actions that companies and individual business owners can take to address biases and processes, as well as policies that can be adopted to create a more fair and equitable environment. The guidebook is divided into 5 sections: evaluation, education, recruitment, retention, and advancement. The guidebook is not a step-by-step book. It does not require companies to have mastered one section before moving on to another. You can read the last chapter first if you want to. We encourage companies to take a look at where their company is at right at the present time and list changes that can make right away, as well as policies that can be adopted over time. One example is the recruitment section of the guidebook. That section focuses on ensuring new hires don't start out at a deficit in pay compared to other employees. One of the best practices listed is to avoid asking for previous wage information during the hiring process, where women have a strict disadvantage. A best practice to adapt over time could be to limit salary negotiation for new hires. Another example, this one from the advancement section, is to have your organization accept the Elevate Her Challenge. That is a challenge. We have the one right here in the red, developed by the Women's Leadership Institute, which is housed right here at the Salt Lake Chamber. The Elevate Her Challenge is a non-prescriptive, research-based action plan to help companies transform women's leadership in their own organizations. To date, more than 250 of Utah's organizations have accepted the Elevate Her Challenge, and they are seeing positive impacts in transforming women's leadership within their organizations and in the workplace. Again, there are several policies and tools that companies and individual business owners can utilize right away to begin to address the gender wage gap. We encourage all of you to review the contents of the document and identify what specific actions your company can take to close the gender wage gap.
Thank you, Pat, and thanks again to everyone for coming today. As a final note, I just want to mention that we recognize that this is not a problem that will be solved with one policy, with one improvement, or in one day. But every step that every Utah business takes will draw us closer towards solving this challenge for Utah's economy. I mentioned earlier that this is a workforce issue, that the number one challenge that we have in the state is finding workers. And it is certainly true that implementing these best practices will help us address that challenge. But I also want to end just by stressing that although this is certainly an economic imperative, it's also a moral imperative for our state. Thanks again for coming. Now, Pat and I will make ourselves available to the media for any one-on-one interviews, but before we do that, we'd love to see if there are any questions either from the media or from the public that we'd be happy to address.
What are some of the reasons that you've heard over the years as to why this gap exists, and is there any validity to any of them?
Yeah. Well, it's multifaceted. There are a lot of rumblings out in the community about what contributes to it. I will tell you from the research that we've done and the anecdotal evidence that we have, there's some cultural influences in Utah I think are quite obvious. A lot of times women here either delay entry into the workforce or are a little more sporadic in their work habits and histories. We have a lot of cottage industries in the state, by women particularly. There's a lack of mentoring in the state. So people helping develop women and in giving them opportunities. Role models. When you don't have women at the top, women like to go where there are other women. Negotiation, as Derek mentioned, is something that's really important, that women learn to negotiate and learn they can negotiate, as his wife said, referred to. There is significant unconscious bias as well in hiring practices and how jobs are advertised and the language that is used in a job description. There are many other internal hiring practices that happen. These kind of informal recommendations where if you have a lot of men at the top, they tend to recommend people like them. So there are things that companies are doing right now to address that. And then we have some stereotypes out there that are quite prevalent. There's a lack of exposure, especially among women, to what opportunities are actually out there. A lot of women are not out in the environment. They don't see going to L3 and some of these other great companies that we have that they just have never imagined themselves being part of. And then we also have what we call occupational segregation, where we have women that tend to go into fields that are a little bit less pay, that tend to be dominated by women, and vice versa. So there are a number of reasons for this. We don't believe that it's just one particular reason, but it's multifaceted, but it is real.
I want to point out, in addition to what Pat has said are those known items, is that there are many unknowns This is what we referenced when we said those unintentional biases in the system. And the reason why I underscore this is because in beginning this process at the Chamber and the Women's Leadership Institute a few months ago, I had the opportunity to sit down with the president of a very large company in Utah that does business worldwide. And this is one of the issues that we were talking about, and he shared with me that because they do business in many countries, and some of those countries actually by law require equal pay, he said, we've just decided as a company that that's what we will do in every country in which we operate. And he said, but Derek, we've discovered something interesting. We do an evaluation and we recognize that there's a gap, and then we implement what needs to be done to close the gap, and then a year later we measure again and the gap is back. And then we do what we need to close the gap, and then we measure a year later and the gap is back. He says it takes, which is why we have in our process, right here, that there's a repeat step, because it's not a one-time kind of a thing. Those unintentional biases that creep back in, those unknowns, whatever they may be, despite all your best intentions, you have to go back and do that repeat step and evaluate step again. Any other questions? Thanks again for coming in. As I mentioned, Pat and I would be happy to do one-on-ones with members of the media.